They knew 300 other prisoners were also in the same situation, being severely tortured. They knew that he had been drugged repeatedly, battered repeatedly, injected with a toxic substance that caused his body to swell horribly until one arm and leg hemorrhaged. Alpirez presided over that particular torture session and received $44,000 in cash a few weeks later at a remote jungle base from a CIA agent. He was considered highly intelligent and tried so many times to escape and almost succeeded that he was placed in a full body cast and then was either tortured to death and buried underneath the Las Cabañas military base, thrown from a helicopter into the ocean, or version 3, dismembered and scattered across a sugarcane field so that I would not be able to identify him. Brought to you by your tax dollars through the CIA 3 years straight. All 300 other prisoners were also dead, but by the time Torricelli was given the truth by the people he was supposed to be supervising. He tried. So did Mr. Richardson, who was also on the Intelligence Committee. So did several other people. The State Department and the CIA covered for the torture and murder of 300 people for 3 years straight in Guatemala. Senator Specter, for the Intelligence Committee, then held a hearing where all of this was discussed in very heated terms in Washington, and we were told this is un-American. It was a few bad apples and it will never happen again. Does any of this ring a bell from Abu Ghraib? At that point, other survivors from across Latin America started coming to me and talking to me about what had happened to them. And many of them, there are a few survivors, but many of those who had survived had actually had CIA people in their torture cells supervising or asking questions. Now that, of course, had been ferociously denied by School of the Americas officials, by the CIA, by all of our government. Supposedly our money was being channeled through our intelligence networks to Latin America to quote-unquote professionalize those militaries. And we knew nothing about where any torture would be happening or any death squads. We were just teaching the armies to carry out their operations more efficiently and more correctly. So that, of course, blew that story away. And we felt that we were really making a few advances when, of course, September 11th happened. And there was no more denial. Instead, it was like, of course we're torturing people. That's what we have to do. It's the new reality. Don't be naive. And in fact, for a little while, there were CIA officials saying it was my fault the World Trade Center fell down on several radio programs. And, you know, at the age of, back then, at the age of 50, unarmed, you know, very gigantic myself, I thought that was fairly hilarious, actually. But that stopped once all of the disclosures about how much information the CIA had received but not used started to come out. Before then, it was me and the ACLU, but like I say, that stopped at that point. Let's talk about Abu Ghraib. What we heard our president and all of our high-level administration officials say right after those photographs came out is, of course, torture is un-American. It was a few bad apples. There were just a few kids out of control on a Saturday night that dreamed up these crazy techniques. They've been court-martialed. There has been justice. You have nothing to worry about. It's the American way. That's what we heard. Then, of course, more and more information started coming out about how these practices were everywhere. Guantanamo, Iraq, Afghanistan, we were beating people to death. Secret prisoners were being hauled away and never seen again. And then the story started to shift a little bit. Maybe it might not just be a few bad apples, but if it wasn't just a few bad apples, then it wasn't quite torture. It was stress and duress and maybe a little humiliating, but not quite torture. And then the second position was, well, if it was torture and it was official practices, it's okay because, you know, these people don't qualify for the Geneva Convention, so technically it's legal. And then the third position was, if it is torture and if it is illegal, then you have to let us do it because what if there was a nuclear weapon, a ticking bomb about to go off and explode under Grand Central Station and kill millions of people in a single hour? Those were the three stories that the government came up with. And I'd like to deal with those three stories one by one so that this doesn't keep happening. Number one, it wasn't really torture, and it wasn't really practices, it was just people getting out of line here and there. Well, torture is very clearly defined in the Convention Against Torture, to which we are a signatory. We also have a statute that adopts that same definition. It's anything that inflicts severe physical pain on anyone. That is physical torture. Psychological torture includes anything where you utilize drugs, anything that would cause psychosis, and any kind of mock execution, such as waterboarding, just to name one. Okay, how far back have these practices gone? If it was just a few bad apples, you wouldn't see them over and over and over again. How far back do these techniques go? How much have we utilized them? And do they inflict severe physical pain, or are they just a little bit rough? We hear waterboarding all the time described as you put a cloth over someone's face and trickle water over them, and it sort of scares them, you know, it's kind of like a prank. Well, I'll share some stories by people who have been waterboarded. Their descriptions are quite graphic. Well, first, of course, we've heard a lot about people being held in water pits of water really deep, that they have to sort of hang on to something to keep from drowning, and they're held there for days on end. That came out of Egypt quite a bit, where we do renditions. We fly the person over there, deliver a large pile of cash and a list of questions, and someone there does it for us. We seem to think that gets us off the hook legally, but normally if someone hires a third person to shoot his wife so he can get the insurance money, that's called murder for hire. It doesn't usually get you off the hook, but you only really wanted the money. If you hire someone to do torture, if you hire someone to do murder, you are legally responsible. Water pits, is that something new that just got dreamed up in Egypt? No, it's in my husband's files. Retululeo, early 80s through the 90s, people were kept in cement-filled pits with water up to above their nostrils so that they had to hang on to overhead bars to keep from drowning. After interrogation sessions, dead or alive, they were thrown into the ocean. Waterboarding. Is this something that just scares people, just makes them a little nervous? No. My friend Antoniel was waterboarded 3 times in Guatemala. Many people have been waterboarded. There's also a physician out of Bolivia or Paraguay, I believe, who's given a very similar description of what that's actually like. The description, in fact, is very universal. It consists of a large tub of water. You strap the person down, often to a board, hence the name waterboarding, not water clothing, and you put the person in bodily and hold them under. As Antoniel said, first the water goes into your brain, so that you have this hideous choking, gagging, and burning sensation, as anyone who's familiar with it's had water go into their nasal cavities. Then as you start really strangling, your ears feel like they're going to rupture because of the change in pressure, and you start vomiting and losing bowel control into the water. After that phase passes, you start going into convulsions, and the next thing he remembers is waking up on the floor with them giving him CPR. After they got the water out of his lungs, they started over. He wasn't talking yet. Is that a mock execution? Well, McCain had no problem with that being torture. It's like, of course that's a mock execution, of course that's torture. But he didn't stop it. He let it go through. That's what waterboarding's like. And as Antoniel said, there was a really tall North American nearby. He came in right afterwards and said, man, they're really giving it to you. You need to start working with them. And then asked him a lot of questions about Cuba. Heavy American accent, tall, fair, bad Spanish. So I don't think he was one of the few tall, blonde Guatemalans that exist. Waterboarding is one. Electrical shocks. We all remember the photograph of the man on the box of the hood with his hands extended and the electrical cables attached. How long has that been going on, and does the United States ever do that? Well, amongst intelligence circles internationally, that's a very well-known technique. It's called the Vietnam position because that's where it originated, with us. With the Phoenix Project, in fact.